there is an unstoppable force. An unstoppable force that cannot be stopped by any state, no matter how powerful it may be. No law can stop it. It is beyond good and evil. It knows no borders. He died in poverty and obscurity, having been largely forgotten by the world. It was published in 1844 and shocked the intellectual establishment at the time with its radical ideas. For Stirner, the ego is not simply a psychological entity, but rather the driving force of all human action and the ultimate standard by which all other things are judged. For Stirner, egoism is not just a selfish or self-centered philosophy, but rather a way of thinking that emphasizes the importance of the individual's own needs and desires as a starting point for ethical and political action. He saw capitalism as a system that allowed a small group of people to accumulate vast amounts of wealth. Stirner did not advocate for a stateless society. Instead, he envisioned a society that was based on the principles of individual freedom and self-determination. He believed that the state should not have the power to tell individuals what they can and can't do. His ideas have been influential in the development of anarchist and anarcho-communist thought and have been used to challenge oppressive political and economic systems throughout history. Despite this, Stirner himself remained relatively unknown throughout most of his life. He died in poverty and obscurity in 1856, having been largely forgotten by the world. However, his ideas continue to be studied and debated by philosophers, activists, and revolutionaries today, and they remain an important part of the history of anarchist thought. But rather that individuals should be free to make their own decisions about how they want to live their lives. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more philosophy. Of course, this doesn't mean that Stirner advocated for violence or lawlessness. He believed that individuals should still be held accountable for their actions, and that they should be free to enter into agreements with one another. However, these agreements should be based on mutual consent and not on the coercive power of the state. And power, while the majority of people were forced to work for low wages and live in poverty. He believed that true ownership of property was impossible because all property is ultimately owned by the state. Any individual who claims to own property actually has a right to use it granted to them by the state, and they can be stripped of that right at any moment by the state as well. Stirner believed that the state has the ultimate say in who can own property and how it can be used, and that no individual truly has the right to own property in their own right. This challenges the traditional capitalist view of property as something that can be privately owned and passed down through inheritance, and it undermines the idea that individuals have a natural right to own property simply because they are individuals. Instead, Stirner argued that property should be seen as a social construct that is created and maintained by the state, and that individuals should not be allowed to hoard property for their own benefit. Instead, property should be used for the benefit of all members of society, and not just a select few. He also criticized communism for its authoritarian and totalistic tendencies, which he believed would inevitably lead to the oppression of the individual. For Stirner, alienation refers to the estrangement of the individual from their own labor and its products. In a capitalist society, workers are alienated from the products they create because they do not own the means of production and therefore do not own the fruits of their labor. They are also alienated from their own species being because they are reduced to being just another cog in the machine, and their creative and productive activities are turned into a means of generating profit for the capitalist class. Stirner believed that this alienation was a fundamental problem with capitalist society and that it led to the dehumanization of the individual. To overcome this alienation, Stirner argued that we need to move beyond traditional economic and political systems and create a new way of organizing society that values the individual and their creative and productive activities. This new way of organizing society would not be based on the exploitation of one class by another, but rather on the principles of individual freedom, self-determination, and the common ownership of the means of production. For Stirner, the only way to break free of this cycle of oppression was to reject all forms of traditional authority, and to affirm the individual's own needs and desires as the ultimate standard of value. He believed that we should not be subject to any external authority, whether that be the authority of the state, the market, or any other form of social pressure. Instead, we should be free to pursue our own interests without interference from others. Stirner argued that the individual should not be subject to any external authority, and that it should be free to pursue its own interests without interference from others. He believed that the traditional moral codes and social norms that had been imposed on individuals by religion, tradition, and the state were nothing more than constraints on the individual's freedom, and that they should be rejected in favor of a more radical form of individualism. Stirner argued that these traditional authorities had too much power over people's lives, and that this power had been used to oppress and exploit individuals for far too long. He believed that it was time for a radical rethinking of our relationship to society and the state, and that we should reject the traditional moral codes and social norms that had been imposed on us. Instead, we should focus on the needs and desires of the individual and make those the starting point of our ethical and political actions. We begin with the premise that we are all individuals first and foremost, and that we all have our own unique perspectives on the world. Our experiences shape us into who we are, and these experiences differ from person to person. Thus, there is no single objective truth, only individual interpretations of reality. This means that what is true for one person may not necessarily be true for another, and that there is no absolute standard by which we can judge the validity of different perspectives. This challenges the traditional view of knowledge and understanding that had dominated Western philosophy since the time of Plato, and it serves as the basis for Stirner's theory of egoism. In this book, Stirner develops his theory of egoism, which challenges traditional morality and calls for a radical rethinking of our relationship to society and the state. So let's take a look at some of the key ideas found in this book. But his ideas continue to inspire revolutionary movements around the globe and have proven to be an immense influence on many alternative thinkers over the years. So who was Max Stirner, and why do so many people consider him to be such a dangerous man that they actively try to erase his memory from history? It defies every attempt to constrain it or bring it under control, and it is constantly growing in strength. What could this unstoppable force be? How does it defy the most powerful states in the world? And why should you care about it? That's what we're going to find out today. Welcome to the channel. Max Stirner, born Johann Caspar Schmidt in 1806, was a German philosopher and the author of the book The Ego and Its Own. It all starts with his book, The Ego and Its Own. The central argument of the ego and its own is that the individual ego is the ultimate source of all values, and that everything else in life must be understood in relation to the individual's own needs and desires. Egoism, in its most basic sense, is the belief that the individual is the ultimate source of all moral and political authority. Stirner was a critic of both capitalism and communism because he believed that both systems were ultimately oppressive and exploitative of the individual. Now, this might sound like Stirner was advocating for pure anarchy, but that's not quite accurate. For Stirner, the concept of property is closely linked to the idea of power. The concept of alienation in Stirner's philosophy is closely related to his critique of traditional economic and political systems. Today, Stirner's ideas continue to inspire activists and revolutionaries around the world who are seeking to create a more just and equitable world. So what do you think? Did you find this video informative, or did it maybe even change your mind on a few things? Let us know in the comments below.